Welcome back, dear listeners, to another story that will reach into your chest and rearrange everything you thought you knew about devotion, divinity, and the extraordinary weight of a single act of faith repeated every single day for years without answer. If you are new here, take a breath, get comfortable, because what you are about to experience is not simply a love story, though it is one of the most profound love stories ever told. It is a story about what happens when the whole world turns away from something sacred, and one small, overlooked, underestimated person refuses to do the same. Before we begin, if stories like this move something in you, if they make you feel seen, or remind you that quiet faithfulness matters, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to keep creating these immersive narratives for you. Now close your eyes if you can. Breathe deeply, and let us begin. The world did not end with fire or flood or the screaming collapse of mountains. It ended for Kale with silence, with the slow, devastating quiet of altars going cold, of prayers that used to rise like warm smoke through the veil between worlds simply stopping, one voice at a time, until the great roaring chorus of devotion that had sustained him for 3,000 years became a whisper, then a murmur, then nothing at all. He felt each abandonment like a small death, a candle snuffed out somewhere in the vast cathedral of his consciousness, and he had not understood at first what was happening. Gods do not easily conceive of their own diminishment. It took centuries for him to recognize that his people were not simply distracted or struggling. They were choosing to forget him, deliberately and with clear intention, guided by the Council of Elders, who had decided that the old ways were inconvenient, that a god of wild places and ancient blood and untamed instinct had no place in the new order they were building. Kale had been the wolf god since before the first werewolf drew breath. He had not created their kind, but he had shaped them, walked beside their earliest ancestors through forests so old and deep that sunlight had forgotten how to reach the ground, taught them to honor the moon and the hunt, and the sacred responsibility of power. He had been fierce and demanding. Yes, because the world was fierce and demanding, and love that did not prepare you for reality was not love, but indulgence. He had required courage from them, accountability, the willingness to face what they were without flinching. He had asked them to be worthy of the gifts their nature gave them, and for millennia they had tried, not always succeeding, but genuinely, earnestly trying. But the elders of the new age had grown weary of being asked to be worthy. They had discovered something far more appealing, a system of artificial magic harvested from bound elemental spirits, a network of power that could be controlled, and distributed and measured and allocated based on rank and political alliance rather than genuine spiritual merit. With this system, an elder did not need to pray or sacrifice or grow or change. He needed only to maintain his position in the hierarchy, to ensure his access to the network, and power would flow to him automatically, endlessly, without the uncomfortable requirement of divine accountability. The wolf god demanded growth. The network demanded only obedience to those who controlled it. The decision to erase Kyle had not been dramatic. There had been no great council debate, no thunderous proclamation. It had been a slow administrative erasure, the kind that is far more effective than any dramatic gesture, because it leaves no martyrs and generates no resistance. His name was quietly removed from official texts. His festivals were reclassified as outdated cultural practices and gradually discontinued. The children stopped being taught his stories, and within 2 generations, there were young werewolves who had genuinely never heard his name. His temples were not burned, because burning creates memory. They were simply allowed to fall into disrepair, their stones reclaimed by the earth, their sacred carvings obscured by moss and time. And as the temples fell, and the prayers ceased and the memory dimmed, Kale felt himself becoming less real, the way a word repeated too many times begins to lose its meaning, until one day you look at it, and it is only shapes, only sounds, bearing no connection to the thing it used to represent. He did not rage. He had expected rage from himself, had braced for it, because he had always been a god of storms and instinct, and the overwhelming, undeniable force of primal feeling. But what he felt instead was something quieter and more terrible. It was grief of a particular kind. The grief of someone who gave everything and watched it not simply be rejected, but be forgotten, as though it had never existed. His love for his people had been the organizing principle of his divinity for 3,000 years. It had been the source of his power and the purpose of his existence. And watching them turn away, watching them choose convenience over growth, hierarchy over spirit, control over genuine connection, had not simply weakened him, it had changed him. The love had curdled, slowly and then all at once, into something dark and cold and heavy. Not hatred, because he was too exhausted for hatred. Something worse. Indifference with teeth. A bitterness so deep it had become structural, part of the architecture of what remained of him. He existed in the space between worlds, half dissolved, held together by nothing more than the stubborn residue of what he had once been, too diminished to manifest, too ancient to simply cease. It was a kind of eternal twilight, neither the fullness of divine existence nor the mercy of ending. He drifted there, in the cold and the quiet, for decades. He watched distantly as the people who had abandoned him built their artificial paradise on the foundation of bound spirits and political machinery. He watched them prosper in the short term, as all systems built on exploitation tend to prosper in the short term. And he waited, because gods, even diminished ones, have a relationship with time that is fundamentally different from mortals. And Kale knew, with the deep cellular certainty of something very old, that systems built on the suffering of bound things do not hold forever. He was deep in that cold twilight, barely aware of anything, when he first heard her. It was not a formal prayer. It was not even particularly articulate. It was a young woman's voice, slightly out of breath as though she had been working hard, saying something like, "I do not know if you are there. I do not know if any of this means anything, but it feels wrong to let it fall apart completely. So I am going to keep coming, and I am going to keep cleaning. And if you are somewhere, listening, I want you to know that I have not forgotten that someone was here." And then the soft sound of a brush against stone, and the smell of cedar smoke drifting through the veil, and the warmth of a small fire lit in a space that had been cold for 30 years. Kyle had not responded. He had barely been capable of registering it that first time, but something in him, some fragment of what he had been, had oriented toward that voice the way a plant turns toward the only window in a dark room, not because she was powerful or special in any way he could initially discern, but because her faith was not contingent. She was not praying to a god she believed would answer. She was tending a space in honor of something she was not even certain existed, out of what seemed to be a pure, uncomplicated conviction that the tending itself was right, that some things deserved to be remembered even if no one was watching, and no reward was coming, and the universe itself seemed indifferent to. The gesture. He had felt that kind of faith before, but he had not felt it in a very long time, and so he had listened, not actively, not with intention, but the way a person who has been sleeping very deeply begins to register sound again, as they drift closer to waking. Her voice became a thread, and the thread became a tether, and the tether held him loosely in place rather than letting him drift further into dissolution. He did not know her name yet. He only knew her voice, and the sound of her working, and the smell of cedar and mountain herbs that she brought with her, and the soft, one-sided conversation she conducted with him every single time she came, which was more often than he would have expected anyone to come, which was to say, consistently, without fail, across all seasons and all weathers, for years. If you are feeling something right now, listeners, that warmth in your chest that comes when you encounter a faithfulness so genuine it almost hurts, please let us know. In the comments, tell us if you have ever held on to something when the world told you to let go. Tell us if you have ever been the person tending a fire no one else believed in. We want to hear from you. Now let us continue. Her name was Lyra, and she was not supposed to be remarkable. She was the daughter of a common Omega family in the village of Asheville, which sat at the very edge of the territory claimed by the Greymane Collective, one of the largest and most politically influential, werewolf factions in the northern territories. Ashvale was a border village in every sense, geographically, socially, economically, the kind of place that existed in the margins of maps and the footnotes of histories, populated by omegas and low-ranking betas, and the occasional alpha who had fallen too far out of political favor to maintain a position closer to the center of power. It was not a bad place, exactly. It was simply a forgotten one. The kind of place where nothing much happened and nothing much was expected to happen, and the people had quietly organized their lives around that expectation, finding their satisfactions in small things and their meanings in local relationships and the particular beauty of a landscape that no one important had bothered to claim. Lyra had grown up in Ashvale's margins even by Ashvale's modest standards. Her father had been a traveling merchant of middling success who came through the village twice a year, and her mother was a healer of genuine, but under-recognized skill who had chosen a quiet life over a more ambitious one and had never seemed to regret it. Lyra had her mother's eyes, the color of winter forests, deep green shading into gray, and her father's restlessness, that constant low hum of awareness that something existed just beyond the edge of vision, just past the horizon, just slightly outside the life she was currently living. She had tried to quiet that restlessness in the usual ways, worked hard at the village apothecary, learned her mother's craft, built friendships and small daily routines. But the restlessness had never entirely quieted. She had found the old shrine when she was 19, during the kind of aimless walking that restlessness produces. It was in the hills above Ashvale, hidden by decades of unchecked growth, accessible by a path so overgrown it was barely a suggestion of a path anymore. The shrine itself was small, built into the natural curve of a rock face, with carved stone walls, that had once been painted in colors now too faded to identify, and a central altar of dark stone worn smooth by generations of hands that had long since stopped touching it. There were no identifying markers she could read, the inscriptions having been worn away or deliberately effaced. But the shape of the space, the intentionality of its construction, the sense of presence that lingered despite everything, had stopped her cold in a way she had not been able to fully articulate then, or afterward. She had stood in that space for a long time, and then she had come back the next day with a broom. That had been 8 years ago. She had never told anyone about the shrine, not because she was intentionally secretive, but because she had quickly understood that the explaining of it would require her to admit to things she could not defend rationally, that she felt something there, that the tending of it felt important, in a way that superseded the importance of things she could name and measure, that sometimes, in the quiet of the late afternoon when the light came through the trees at a certain angle, she felt less alone than she had ever felt anywhere else. These were not the kinds of statements that went over well in a village community organized around practical concerns. And Lyra had always had a healthy instinct for which truths to keep private. She had learned over the years certain things about the shrine through careful research in Ashvale's small library and a few carefully worded letters to scholars in larger towns. The shrine was old, far older than Ashvale, old enough that the village had grown up around its general vicinity, rather than the other way around. It had been dedicated to a deity whose name had been removed from all official records, which the scholars told her was a common administrative practice of the Greymane Collective's founding generation, which had systematically erased older spiritual traditions to consolidate religious authority around the network-bound system of elemental magic they controlled. The deity's domain had been something to do with wolves and ancient power, and the wilder aspects of the natural world. Beyond that, the records were silent. She had taken this information and sat with it, and eventually decided that it changed nothing about what she was doing. Whoever had been honored in this place had clearly been important to someone, had clearly meant something real, and the deliberate erasure of that meaning struck her, not as the triumph of progress, but as an act of profound disrespect toward something that deserved better. She could not give it back its proper recognition. She could not restore the inscriptions, or rebuild what had been taken down, or make the people who had walked away feel what they had once felt. But she could sweep the floor and clear the weeds, and bring cedar smoke and mountain herbs and speak, into the silence, the simple true words of someone who had not Forgotten. It was, she would have said if anyone had asked her, the bare minimum. It was the least she could do. She said this to herself sometimes, quietly, as she worked, and did not yet understand that in a world where everyone else was doing nothing, the bare minimum was an act of extraordinary power. Kyle heard this. He heard everything now, though his hearing was still distant, still muffled by the layers of dissolution between him and full awareness. He heard her say, one afternoon in early autumn, when the light was the color of old gold and the first chill of the changing season was in the air, "I brought chamomile today because the rosemary is done for the year, and the cedar felt like too much for a Tuesday. I hope that is acceptable. I realize I have been having these conversations with you for years, and I do not technically know if you prefer chamomile or rosemary, or whether you have preferences about offerings at all, but it seems polite to explain my choices, in case you are paying attention." And then she had laughed at herself, a soft, self-aware sound, and Cale had felt something shift inside him that he had not felt in a very long time. He had felt almost amused. The feeling was so foreign to what he had become that he had not recognized it at first. It took him several moments to identify it, to trace its shape and texture, and locate it in the archive of his ancient emotional memory. Almost amused, not quite, because the layers of bitterness and grief were still there, still heavy, still fundamental, but something had moved beneath them. Something very small, a flicker, the faintest possible reminder that he had once been capable of delight. He had filed this away and continued to listen. The crisis, when it came, did not surprise him, because he had seen it coming from a long way off, from that cold, distant vantage point where diminished gods drift and observe, the artificial network of elemental magic that the Greymane Collective had built. Its power on was failing. He could feel it in the way you can feel weather changing before it arrives, a pressure shift, a quality of tension in the air that announces itself before any visible sign appears. The bound elemental spirits at the core of the network, enslaved for generations, had been degrading for decades, their essence thinning as it was perpetually harvested without rest or renewal, and the degradation had reached a tipping point. The network was not simply weakening, it was beginning to consume its users, those who had connected themselves most deeply to it, the high-ranking alphas and elders who had organized their entire identity and power around their access to the network, were beginning to feel it pulling at them from the inside, drawing on their own life force to compensate for the thinning elemental supply. The elders knew this. They had known it for years and had concealed it, because admitting the failure would mean admitting that the entire foundation of their authority was built on a system that was eating the people it was supposed to serve. They had tried patch after patch, desperate magical intervention after desperate magical intervention, binding additional spirits, adjusting the extraction parameters, attempting to renegotiate the fundamental architecture of the network from within, and none of it had worked. And they were running out of time, and out of options, and out of the ability to keep the truth hidden from the general population. Lyra did not know any of this when she came to the shrine on the morning that everything changed. She knew only that something in the world felt wrong in a way she could not name, that she had woken from dreams she could not remember, feeling frightened in a way she could not explain, and that her feet had taken her up the hill before she had consciously decided to go. She arrived at the shrine breathing harder than usual, not from the physical exertion, but from something else, some urgency that had installed itself in her chest without her permission, and she stood in front of the cold altar, and she did something she had never done before in 8 years of faithful tending. She did not bring offerings. She did not speak quiet, one-sided, self-aware commentary about the herbs she had chosen. She stood in front of that ancient stone altar, and she said, plainly and without artfulness, "Something is wrong. I do not know what it is. I cannot fix it. But if you are there, if you have ever been there, I need you to know that people are in danger, and I do not know how to help them, and I am asking you to." She pressed both hands flat against the altar stone and she said, "Please, whatever you are, whoever you were, please." The power that moved through that space in the next moment was not the gentle, manageable warmth of a standard magical response. It was something so old and so immense that Lyra's vision went white at the edges, and her knees buckled and she caught herself against the altar with both arms and held on. The stone beneath her hands was suddenly burning hot, and then ice cold, and then vibrating at a frequency she felt in her teeth and her bones and the chambers of her heart. The carved walls of the shrine blazed with light that pulsed like a heartbeat, blue, white, and ancient, and the dead inscriptions she had never been able to read blazed into visibility for a single blinding second. And in that second, between one heartbeat and the next, the space between the altar and the rock wall filled with something that had not been there before. He was not what she had imagined, though she had never let herself imagine specifically, because specificity in faith had always seemed to her a form of arrogance. He was immense, and he was incomplete, like a statue broken in several significant places, but still recognizably what it had been, still bearing the lines and forms of something that had once been breathtaking in its wholeness. His form shifted, between wolf and man and something that was neither, that existed in the space between those categories the way lightning exists in the space between cloud and ground, there and then not, and then there again. His eyes were the color of the sky just before a storm, that particular gray-silver that exists for perhaps 2 minutes before the light changes, and they were full of something that Lyra, in her disoriented state, took several seconds to correctly identify. They were full of pain, not the performance of pain, not the theatrical suffering of a divine being, making its suffering known for effect. Real, structural, bone-deep pain. The kind that has been present so long it is no longer something you feel separate from yourself, but something you have become. She knew that kind of pain. She had seen it in her mother's patients. She had felt a version of it herself in smaller mortal doses, and recognizing it in this vast, half-dissolved ancient thing that was vibrating in the space above her altar made something in her relax its grip on the defensive detachment she had not known she was holding. "Oh," she said, still half-collapsed against the altar. "You are hurt." The form above her shifted and changed, and for a moment, it coalesced into something more fully present, and she felt the weight of attention fix on her with an intensity that made the air pressure in the shrine change perceptibly. When he spoke, it was not sound so much as a frequency she felt in her chest, below the range of normal hearing, but carrying meaning as clearly as language. What he communicated was not words, but impressions. Something like, "Why are you still here after all this time?" And beneath that, complicated and layered and not entirely fully intentional, something like, "I know you. I have been listening." Lyra took a careful breath. She was still frightened, very much so, but she had spent enough time in this shrine tending something she could not see or verify that she had, developed a working relationship with not knowing, with the willingness to continue acting in the presence of uncertainty. She said, "I am still here because I thought you deserved someone to be still here. I am sorry it took a crisis for me to actually call out loud. I should have done it sooner." And then, because she was Lyra and she could not help it even in the presence of an ancient and partially dissolved deity, she added, "Though I realize in retrospect that all my Tuesday chamomile monologues might have been a form of calling out loud. I am perhaps not very direct." The form above her shifted again, and this time she was almost certain that what moved through that shifting, briefly, was something like the ghost of something that had once been amusement. Listeners, if you are invested in these two finding their way toward each other across the enormous gap of what has been lost and what remains, please drop a comment below. Let us know what you are feeling right now. And if you are not yet subscribed, now is absolutely the time, because this story is going to take you somewhere, and you want to be on this journey from the beginning. Let us continue. Kale had not intended to manifest. He had not had the power to manifest in decades. What had happened was not a choice, but a response, something that had occurred below the level of conscious decision, his ancient nature responding to the specific quality of her call, before his battered, bitter awareness had had the opportunity to evaluate and decline. And now he was here, more present than he had been in 30 years, held in this space by her hands on his altar, and her voice in his space, and the particular devastating texture of her faith, which was unlike any faith he had received in all his long existence. Most faith, even genuine faith, carried want within it. Humans and werewolves prayed because they wanted something, wanted protection, wanted guidance, wanted power, wanted healing, wanted the comfort of believing something larger than themselves was paying attention. Even the most devoted of his ancient worshippers had brought that want with them. He had not minded. Want was part of being alive, and it was not ignoble. But Lyra's faith had been, for 8 years, almost entirely free of want. She had tended his shrine, not because she expected anything from him, but because she believed the tending was right. And that particular quality, faith without expectation, devotion without agenda, the willingness to give and give and give without requiring return, was something he had never encountered in exactly this form, and it was doing something to him that he was not sure how to respond to. It was reaching him, through all the layers of abandonment and bitterness and dissolution, through all the cold accumulated weight of what his people had done and what he had become in response. It was reaching him, not removing those things, not erasing them or healing them in any sudden, dramatic way, just reaching through them, the way warmth reaches through a thick wall over a long time, not by breaking it, but by persisting. He managed, with considerable effort, to communicate to her in a more structured way than impressions. He told her, in the halting, frequency-based language of a god who had nearly forgotten how to speak to mortals, that she had called him at a critical moment, that the network she likely did not know existed was collapsing, that the collapse would accelerate, and that people would die. Not dramatically, but in the quiet, awful way that happens when the systems people depend on fail, and those who built those systems have no interest in admitting failure. He told her that he did not know if he had the power to do anything about this. He told her that he was not, at present, what he had been. She listened to all of this with the focused attention of someone who takes in information before responding. And then she said, "What do you need?" He had not expected the question. He had expected fear or reverence or the particular complicated gratitude of someone who has just had their faith confirmed. He had not expected practical problem-solving orientation. He found that he did not know how to answer. She said, "I realize that may be a complicated question for a deity. Let me be more specific. What is the one most useful thing I can do right now?" He considered, and then he told her that there were people in Ashvale who were connected to the network, not deeply, not by choice, but because the network pervaded the territory and anyone living within it absorbed trace connections simply through prolonged proximity. And those trace connections were now conduits for the network's failing energy, and the people carrying them were going to start experiencing symptoms, disorientation, exhaustion, physical pain, within days. He told her that her mother was a healer. He told her that mountain herbs prepared in specific ways could create a barrier between a person and their trace network connection, could protect them from the worst of the withdrawal. He told her he could teach her the preparations. Lyra was already reaching for the bag she had brought with her, the one she always brought, filled with the herbs she tended from her mother's garden and gathered from the hills. She said, "Tell me." What followed was several hours that would not have looked, to an outside observer, like much of anything. A young Omega woman, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a ruined shrine, eyes half-closed in concentration, hands moving over herbs in the particular patterns a half-dissolved deity was showing her through impressions and gentle guidance of her physical awareness. A space that glowed faintly with old light that faded as the hours passed. A quiet that was not empty, but full. The specific fullness of two presences learning the dimensions of each other. Kyle taught her and watched her learn and felt something unfamiliar moving through him. He could not immediately name it. It took him a long time, sifting through 3,000 years of emotional archive, to recognize it as the feeling of being trusted with something that matters. She was taking what he gave her seriously. She was applying it with care and intelligence. She was asking questions when she did not understand rather than proceeding in ignorance, and her questions were good ones, the kind that demonstrated genuine engagement rather than the performance of engagement. She was treating his knowledge as real and significant, not because she was being deferential or performatively reverent, but because she had assessed it as real and significant, and she was constitutionally incapable of treating real and significant things as otherwise. He had been treated as sacred by thousands of worshippers, but it had been a long time since anyone had treated him as real. The distinction was not a small one. By the time the light in the shrine had faded entirely and the evening was settling cool and blue over the hills, Lyra had prepared enough of the protective compound to treat most of Ashvale's population. She packed it carefully into the containers she had brought without initially knowing why she had felt the compulsion to bring containers. She said quietly, to the presence that she could feel was still there but fading, "I will come back tomorrow." She felt, rather than heard, the response, something that carried the texture of, "I will be here." And underneath that, quiet as an afterthought, something that felt remarkably like, "Thank you." She walked down the hill in the early dark, and she was different in a way she could not yet quantify. Something had shifted in the fundamental architecture of herself. She did not have language for it yet. She just walked and felt it and let it be what it was. The next several days in Ashvale were hard ones, though they would have been much harder without what Lyra had prepared. The symptoms began, as Cale had warned, gradually, and then with increasing urgency. People woke with headaches that built through the day into migraines that made it impossible to function. Older community members began experiencing what looked like the symptoms of severe exhaustion, despite adequate rest. 3 of the young adults who had received slight upgrades to their network connection for vocational reasons went down hard, barely able to stand, trembling and disoriented. The one healer in the village, Lyra's mother, Mira, was quickly overwhelmed, and it was Lyra who moved through the community with the compound she had prepared, explaining to each family in the patient, clear-eyed way she had learned from her mother that this would help, without being able to fully explain why, that they should trust her, without being able to fully explain how she knew. They trusted her. People in small, overlooked communities often develop finely calibrated trust networks, and Lyra had lived in Ashvale her entire life, and had never given anyone a reason to doubt her. The compound worked, as Cale had promised it would, creating a buffer between the person's trace network connection and the worst of the withdrawal, reducing symptoms to manageable levels. The community stabilized. People who had been afraid began to be less afraid, and Lyra went back to the shrine every evening and reported, in her matter-of-fact, slightly self-aware conversational style, on how the day had gone. These evenings were when Kyle began to remember things he had nearly lost. He remembered what it felt like to have someone speak to him as though he were real. She did not speak to him the way his ancient worshippers had spoken to him, with the reverence and the careful language and the awareness of performance that public devotion inevitably carried. She spoke to him the way you speak to someone you have been talking to for a long time and have stopped being self-conscious around. She told him things that were not important, not crucial, not urgent, just the texture of her days. She told him about a difficult family she had treated, whose oldest son had refused the compound until his mother cried. She told him about a disagreement she had had with the village council about resource allocation. She told him about a book she was reading and what she thought was wrong with its central argument. She told him, one evening when the stars were very clear above the broken roof of the shrine, that she had been lonely for a long time, and had not fully admitted it to herself until very recently, and that she was not sure whether what she was experiencing now counted as not lonely, given the significant ontological complications of the being she was currently spending her evenings with. He found, to his own considerable bewilderment, that he looked forward to these evenings. He, who had become a thing of cold bitterness and patient, grinding grief, found that he looked forward to her. This was not something he had anticipated. He had expected to use her, in the most straightforward sense, as a conduit back to enough power to address the network crisis, and then to return to his twilight existence. And he had not thought much beyond that. He had not considered that she might be someone worth thinking much beyond that about. He had not considered that she might make him remember what it felt like to be someone who looks forward to things. He began to be more deliberately present during their evenings. He shaped himself more carefully, pulled his form into greater coherence, not because he needed to, but because he found that the effort of being more present for her felt worthwhile in a way that effort had not felt worthwhile in a very long time. He began to communicate more fluidly, finding that the old pathways between his consciousness and mortal language were less atrophied than he had believed, requiring not reconstruction, but simply use after long disuse. He told her things, not just practical information, not just guidance relevant to the crisis, but things about himself, about what he had been, about what had happened, about what the abandonment had felt like, and what it had made him. He did this carefully and without drama, the way you lower something fragile into water, watching for breakage. And she received it the way she seemed to receive most things, with attentive stillness and the particular quality of listening that does not rush to respond, but waits for the full shape of what is being said before it engages. She asked questions that were not deflections, but genuine attempts to understand. She did not try to make what had happened to him sound less than it was. She did not offer quick comfort or easy reassurance. She sat with the weight of it and let it be the weight it was, and that, he had learned in his long existence, was rarer and more valuable than anything that could be said. She said, one night, after he had told her about the final years of the abandonment, about the last prayers fading and the last altars going cold, "I am angry on your behalf. I want you to know that. What was done to you was wrong, not just strategically or politically, but fundamentally, as a matter of how living things ought to be treated. You were real, and you were present, and you were serving them, and they erased you, because you asked something of them they did not want to give. That is a specific kind of wrong, and it deserves to be named." He had been still for a long time after she said this, and then he had communicated something he had not communicated to anyone, ever, in 3,000 years. He told her that her anger on his behalf was the first uncomplicated kindness he had received in longer than she had been alive, and that he did not know what to do with it. She said gently, "You do not have to do anything with it. It is just true. You can let it be true." Listeners, we need a moment here. If you are somewhere private, if you have the space for it, take a breath. Because this story is not just about a God being restored by a devotee's faith. It is about two beings, one enormous and ancient and broken, one small and mortal and overlooked, recognizing in each other something that neither of them had been able to name before. It is about what happens when the person who kept believing in you turns out to be someone you can believe in back. Please, if this story is finding you where you live, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And now, let us go to where the real stakes begin. The Greymane Collective's leadership arrived in Ashvale on a cold morning, 12 days after the crisis began. And they arrived in force. 6 elders and their retinues, and an escort of high-ranking alphas whose body language communicated authority in the practiced, performative way of people who have never had to function without it. Their ostensible purpose was to assess and address the network crisis in the outlying territories. Their actual purpose, which they did not announce and which Lyra understood within approximately 10 minutes of their arrival, was to contain the information, to manage the narrative, to ensure that what was happening was understood by the affected communities as a temporary technical difficulty, rather than a catastrophic structural failure that indicted the entire foundation of the collective's power. They were very good at this. They had resources, they had authority, they had the practiced confidence of institutions that have never been seriously held accountable for anything, and they deployed all of this with smooth, experienced efficiency. Within hours of arriving, they had established a command center in the village's largest building, begun distributing an official compound for the network symptoms that was slightly less effective than what Lyra had made, but came with official packaging and authoritative instructions, and begun the quiet, systematic work of ensuring that anyone with influence in the community understood that speaking to outsiders about what was happening would be viewed unfavorably by the collective. Lyra watched all of this with the clarity of someone who has been paying attention to the gap between official narratives and actual reality for most of her adult life. She watched the elders perform concern and competence while refusing to answer direct questions about the nature or cause of the crisis. She watched the alphas in the escort position themselves at key social junctions in the community, collecting information and gently shaping what was said and to whom. She watched people she respected quietly adjust their speech and posture in response to the presence of authority, the unconscious behavioral modification that happens when power enters a space. And she felt something that was not quite anger, but was adjacent to it, something colder and more deliberate. She went to the shrine that evening and told Kale everything she had observed. He listened without interrupting, which she had learned was his default mode, listening fully before responding. When she finished, he told her that what she had described was consistent with what he had been observing from his expanding perspective as his power gradually, incrementally grew. He told her that the elders were not wrong, that the network crisis was manageable in the short term. He told her that they were concealing the medium-term reality, which was that without fundamental reconstruction of the network's foundations, the crisis would return, worse, within a year. He told her that the reconstruction required acknowledging that the bound elemental spirits at the network's core deserved freedom rather than continued enslavement, that the fundamental model would have to change, that power would have to be redistributed rather than extracted, and that none of this was remotely politically viable under the current collective leadership because it required them to admit that everything they had built was built wrong. Lyra said, what would they need to build it right? He said that they would need the cooperation of the elemental spirits, who would have to be released from their bindings and invited to participate in a genuine compact rather than forced extraction. He said that this required someone the elemental spirits trusted. He said that it also required political pressure sufficient to compel the elders to consider options they would under normal circumstances never consider. He paused and then added, with something in his communication that might have been deliberate understatement, that his own return to even partial restoration might constitute some form of leverage, given that the system the elders had built had been explicitly constructed to replace him. Lyra said, they will not like that. He communicated something that was unmistakably dry. She found, to her own surprise, that she was smiling. What followed was 3 weeks. That would later be described, in the histories that were eventually written about this period, as the Reckoning of Ashvale. Though at the time it felt to Lyra less like a historical event and more like an extremely stressful series of conversations and logistical challenges conducted against a background of political pressure and the ongoing surreal experience of being in daily contact with a partially reconstructed ancient deity who was becoming, against what she suspected were his own preferences, someone she was genuinely fond of. The first challenge was the elemental spirits. Kale had connections to the oldest of them that predated the network by centuries, and he used those connections carefully, approaching not as a god demanding deference, but as a very old being, extending what amounted to a formal apology for the failure of his people to prevent what had happened to them. This required a quality of humility from him that Lyra watched with something she later identified as awe, because she understood what it cost him, understood that bowing before beings he had once casually commanded required him to choose, consciously and repeatedly, to prioritize the goal over the instinct. She watched him do it, and she thought, he is better than he knows he is. The elemental spirits, after considerable deliberation, agreed to speak with representatives of the Ashvale community about the terms of a potential compact. Lyra was the one who organized those representatives, the one who held the initial meetings and managed the considerable challenge of helping her community understand what they were being asked to engage with without the full context of everything she knew, which would have been overwhelming. She was patient and clear and honest about what she did not know, and she created a committee of 7 community members who would engage with the spirits on the community's behalf. The second challenge was the elders. This was harder. The elders had not come to Ashvale to be challenged. They had come to manage and contain and depart with the narrative intact, and the emergence of an organized community position, backed by the impossible-to-ignore evidence of a resurgent divine presence, was not something their plans had accounted for. The senior elder, a man of great political experience and correspondingly great political cynicism named Harvin, responded to Lyra's initial formal request for a meeting with the particular condescension of someone who has been managing troublesome lower-ranking people for so long that the management has become reflexive and largely contemptuous. He sat across from her in the village's small meeting room and he said, "You are an Omega healer in a border village. I am not certain I understand what you believe you have to offer to this conversation." Lyra said, "I am the person who stabilized this community before you arrived, using knowledge I was given by the deity your predecessors erased. I believe that offers a certain amount of conversational standing." He had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had said, very carefully, "What deity?" The meeting that followed was not comfortable for anyone, but it was honest, which was more than the elders' previous meetings on the subject had been. Lyra was not aggressive or accusatory. She was precise. She laid out what she knew, what she could demonstrate, and what she was proposing, which was not the destruction of the collective, or the punishment of the elders, but a structured reconstruction of the network on foundations that did not require the ongoing suffering of enslaved beings. She made the case for this not on moral grounds alone, though the moral case was simple, and she made it clearly, but on practical grounds. A system that consumes the people it is supposed to serve is not a sustainable system, and the elders could either participate in building the replacement or they could resist and watch it happen without them. Cale's presence at that meeting was indirect but unmistakable. He could not appear in a building full of elders without triggering responses that would have derailed everything, but he was present in the way that significant power is always present, in the quality of the air, in the particular stillness that settles over a room when something old and enormous is paying attention to what happens in it. Harvin felt it. She could see him feeling it in the small, careful way his posture adjusted, the way his certainty became slightly less automatic. He was a man who had operated his entire career without genuine accountability. But he was not stupid, and he could feel the weight of what was in the room with them even if he could not name it. He said, at the end of 2 hours, "I am not in a position to make commitments on behalf of the full council." Lyra said, "I know. I am asking you to be in a position to take a proposal to them." "That is a different thing." He said nothing for a long moment. And then he said, "What do you want in exchange?" Lyra said, "I want the people of this village, and the people of every border community like this one, to receive the same quality of network protection that the Central Territories receive. I want the historical records of the deity your predecessors erased to be restored and made publicly accessible. And I want a formal acknowledgement that the current network model is inadequate, and that reconstruction is necessary." She paused. "I am not asking for apologies or punishment. I am asking for honesty and change. Those are not the same thing, and they are much more useful." Harvin looked at her for a long time, and then he said quietly, "You are not what I expected when I came to this village." Lyra said, "No, I rarely am." She came to the shrine that night, and sat in the dark, and felt the exhaustion of the past 3 weeks settling into her bones. The presence that was Cale was there, closer and more coherent than it had ever been. And she leaned against the altar with her eyes closed and said, "I do not know if any of that will work." He communicated something that carried the texture of, "It was the right thing to do regardless of whether it works." She said, "That is easy for an ancient deity to say." He communicated something that was unmistakably, genuinely amused. And then, more carefully, something that was more deliberate, something she had to sit still to receive clearly, that she had done, in 3 weeks, what he had failed to do in centuries of divine oversight, that she had held people to account without destroying them, that she had asked for change without requiring suffering as the price of it, that she had looked at a system built on wrong foundations and proposed something better rather than simply condemning what was broken. He told her that she was teaching him things. She opened her eyes and looked at the place where his presence was most concentrated, that slightly luminous area above and behind the altar. And she said, "You are teaching me things too." And then, carefully, because she had been sitting with this for some time and had decided it was something she needed to say out loud, she said, "I care about you." Whatever that means given the significant differences in our nature and circumstances and the significant unresolved questions about what either of our futures looks like. I care about you, and I wanted you to know that I know I care about you because I have a history of being aware of things and not saying them out loud, and I am trying to do that less. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that happens when something has landed in a space it did not expect to be received in and is still settling into the fact of its reception. And then Cale communicated something he had not communicated to any living being in 3,000 years. He told her that he cared about her too, that he did not entirely know what that meant for something in his condition, but that she had returned him to himself in ways he had not believed were possible, and that what he felt when she was present was something he wanted to preserve and extend and attend to with whatever capacity he had, which was growing, slowly, but in ways that no longer felt hypothetical. He told her that she was the first thing in a very long time that had made him want to be more present in the world, rather than less, and that he was not certain he knew what to do with that, but that he intended to learn. Listeners, take a breath, please, because this is not a story about a mighty God being saved by the love of a human woman in the diminishing way that phrase sometimes implies. This is a story about two damaged, overlooked, underestimated beings, one enormous and one small, finding each other in the ruins of what had been abandoned and building something in that space that neither of them had words for yet. Tell us in the comments. Did you see this coming? Did you feel the shift happening? We want to know. Now let us finish this. The Council's formal response arrived 6 weeks after Harvin's return to the Central Territories, and it was, by the standards of large institutions being asked to fundamentally restructure themselves, remarkably substantive. Not everything Lyra had asked for. Institutions that have operated under a specific model for generations do not transform overnight regardless of the pressure applied, and Lyra had understood this going in. But the response acknowledged the network's structural inadequacy in formal written language that could not be recalled or reinterpreted. It committed to a reconstruction process in partnership with representatives of the affected communities and the elemental spirits willing to participate in the compact. It agreed to restore access to historical records, including those pertaining to the erased divine tradition, though the specific language around this was carefully hedged, and it extended, with somewhat less grace than Lyra might have hoped, but more honesty than she had expected, an acknowledgement that border communities had been systematically underserved, and that this would be formally addressed in the reconstruction framework. It was a beginning. It was not everything. Lyra had never expected everything. She had expected a beginning. She read the Council's response in the shrine on a clear winter morning, and when she finished, she set it down on the altar and sat for a while in the quiet. Cale's presence was strong now, stronger than it had been at any point since she had called him 3 months ago. She could see him, not always and not completely, but regularly, in the particular quality of light that gathered above the altar, in the shapes that occasionally cohered in her peripheral vision, in the warmth that was always present in this space, regardless of the winter cold outside. He was not what he had been. He would not be what he had been for some time, possibly ever. 3,000 years of diminishment could not be undone in months, but he was present and growing and, she thought, genuinely if cautiously looking forward to things, which was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. She said, "It is a beginning." He communicated something that carried the texture of agreement, and beneath that, something she had learned to recognize as his version of warmth. He told her that beginnings were not small things, that most of the most important things that had ever happened had begun in places as small and overlooked as this one, between beings as unexpected as the two of them. She looked up at the space where he was most present, and she said, "Are we doing this then? whatever this is. He told her that he believed they were. He told her that he had several significant logistical concerns about a relationship between a partially reconstructed deity and a mortal Omega healer from a border village, which he was prepared to enumerate if she felt that would be useful. He told her that he was also aware that all of his concerns were secondary to the primary fact, which was that the prospect of her continued presence in his existence was something he valued with a specificity and sincerity that surprised him. She said, "I also have concerns. We can enumerate them together. That seems like the right way to start." He communicated something that was, fully and without qualification this time, amusement. Real amusement. The kind that lives in a warm body and moves through you and changes the quality of your breath. She heard it, actually heard it, for the first time. A sound like distant wind through ancient trees, enormous and gentle at once. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She said, "There it is," he said, with actual voice, rough from disuse but present. "There it is." The reconstruction of the Greymane Collective's network took 4 years. It was not a smooth process. There were political crises and backsliding, and moments when it seemed that the inertia of the old system would simply reassert itself regardless of what had been agreed to in writing. There were elders who worked against the process in bad faith while outwardly supporting it. There were community members who were frightened of change and expressed that fear in ways that were destructive rather than constructive. There were elemental spirits who declined to participate in the compact no matter what. Terms were offered, because 4 generations of enslavement is not a wound that diplomatic negotiation entirely heals, and Lyra and the committee she had built had to accept that some bridges were simply too broken to repair and proceed with those who were willing. Kale was present throughout all of this, increasingly present as his power grew, though he chose to remain subtle in how he engaged, understanding that a god reinserted into a political process, with all the force of his full authority, would simply produce a different kind of imbalance rather than genuine structural reform. He guided and advised and occasionally, when the process required it, made his presence known in ways that reminded everyone involved that something ancient and unignorable was paying attention to whether they kept their commitments. But he allowed the process to be carried by the people involved in it, because he had learned, through watching Lyra work for 3 months, that change made by people carries further and holds firmer than change imposed from outside. He and Lyra did not have an easy relationship. They had a real one, which is a different thing and in many ways a better one. They disagreed, sometimes significantly, about approach and priority, and the question of how much patience was appropriate when institutions were actively delaying necessary change. He had the long view of something that had existed for 3 millennia. She had the urgent view of someone whose community was living, with the consequences of delay in the immediate present, and sometimes these perspectives produced friction that neither of them was good at navigating gracefully. They argued with a specificity and earnestness that indicated they took each other seriously, which is the only kind of argument worth having, and they came through those arguments with a better understanding of each other's perspective than they had going in, which is the only good argument outcome. He manifested more completely over those years, his form cohering into something more consistently present, able to maintain physical coherence in the shrine, and eventually, carefully, outside it. He looked like himself again, or rather like a version of himself that had learned something his original self had not known, that power does not require the refusal of vulnerability, that the ability to be reached and changed by another being is not weakness, but the precondition of genuine relationship. His eyes had lost the raw, structural pain they had held when Lyra first called him, not because the pain had been erased, but because it had been witnessed and named and moved through, which is how pain changes. He learned, through her, to speak the way mortals speak, in words rather than frequencies, in language shaped for sharing rather than divine proclamation. She told him once that he was surprisingly good at conversation, given that he had been incommunicado for 30 years, and he told her that he had had an excellent teacher, and she told him that was a very smooth line for an ancient deity, and he told her that he had had 30 years to practice it in his head. and she laughed in the way she laughed when something surprised her into genuine delight, sudden and unguarded and completely unperformed. And he thought, as he had thought on many occasions, that it was the most clarifying sound in the world. 4 years after the reckoning of Ashvale, on a spring evening when the hills above the village were covered in the first new growth of the season, the last of the formal reconstruction agreements was signed. The network was not, by then, what it had been. It was different, more distributed, more equitable, powered by willing compact rather than forced extraction, carrying less raw power, but distributing that power more justly and without the consuming, cannibalizing quality that had made its failure inevitable. The elemental spirits who had joined the compact described their participation in the careful communal language they used as the difference between being used and being valued. The border communities, Ashvale among them, had been formally integrated into the resource allocation frameworks that had previously served only the central territories. It was not a perfect system. Lyra would have been the first to say so, with characteristic precision, identifying the 3 most significant remaining structural weaknesses and the specific interventions required to address them over the next decade. But it was a better one. It was one that could become better still, which the old system had not been, because the old system had been designed to preserve itself rather than to improve, and a system designed to preserve itself can never acknowledge the necessity of change without acknowledging its own inadequacy. Harvin had retired from the eldership 2 years into the reconstruction process, citing health reasons that Lyra suspected were at least partially in the health reasons of a man who has had to genuinely reckon with what his institution built and carry that weight, and found it heavier than anticipated. She did not know whether to call this justice or simply consequence, and she had eventually decided that the distinction was less important than she had once thought. The shrine in the hills above Ashvale was no longer in disrepair. It had been restored, carefully, over 4 years, not to what it had originally been, but to something appropriate, to what it was now, a place where an old and gradually reconstituting God, and the Omega healer who had kept faith with him, received visitors who wanted to understand what had happened, and why, and what came next. These visitors were more numerous than Lyra had expected. People came from across the territory, some out of genuine spiritual interest, some out of political calculation, some out of the complicated human need to be in the presence of something that had survived what it had been, subjected to, and continued anyway. Kyle received them all with a quality of presence that was different from what his ancient worshippers had described, less overwhelming, more human in scale, marked by the particular attention of someone who has learned that being present to a specific individual is worth more than performing divinity to a crowd. Lyra received them with her characteristic combination of clarity and patience, and the willingness to answer difficult questions without softening their difficulty. She had become, without entirely intending it, a figure of significance in the reconstruction of the collective's spiritual and political frameworks, consulted on questions of community organization and network ethics, and the practical realities of building accountable institutions. This had required her to acquire a kind of authority she was not naturally comfortable with, and she managed it the way she managed most challenges, by being extremely honest about the limits of what she knew, and very clear about the reasoning behind everything she advocated for. On a quiet evening in the 5th year after the crisis, Lyra sat in the restored shrine as the light went golden through the repaired roof, and Cale sat beside her, fully present, more whole than he had been in 30 years, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she had been doing for about a year now, when the day had been long and the work had been difficult, and she needed to remember what she was working toward. She said, "You know what I think about sometimes?" He said, "Tell me." She said, "I think about that first day, when I came up here with a broom because it felt wrong to let it fall apart, and I think about how I had no idea what I was doing or why it mattered. I just thought something deserved to be tended. And I think about how that single, specific, small thing is connected to everything that came after. And I cannot quite fit it in my head. The size of what one decision to keep showing up produced. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quality of quiet that meant he was thinking carefully about what to say. He said, "I think about it too. I was very nearly gone. Another few years, perhaps. And there would not have been enough of me left to respond even to a call as clear as yours. The margin was smaller than I would like to admit," she said. "Then I am glad I did not take a few more years to feel ready." He looked at her, and she looked at him. And what was between them was not the bond of a god and his devotee, or the gratitude of a resurrected being toward its rescuer, or the uncomplicated sweetness of new love. Though it had elements of all of those things, it was something older, and more specific, and more honest than any of those things. It was the bond of two beings who had seen each other in their most diminished states and had chosen to continue. It was built of chamomile on Tuesdays and long evenings in a cold shrine, and arguments about institutional reform and the particular pleasure of learning someone well enough to know how they sound when they are genuinely amused. It was real in the way that things built slowly and deliberately and without guarantee of return are real, which is the most real things ever get. He said, "I am glad too." She took his hand, which was solid now, warm, real. She held it. Outside, the evening settled over the hills, and the first stars appeared above Ashevale, and somewhere in the territory the new network hummed its quieter, more equitable hum, and the world was not fixed, but it was better than it had been, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything that had ever been needed for the next beginning, and that, dear listeners, is where we will leave them. Not at an ending, because this is not a story that ends. It is a story about the things that begin when you refuse to stop tending what deserves to be tended. Lyra kept showing up to an empty shrine for 8 years. 8 years of chamomile on Tuesdays and cedar smoke and one-sided conversations and sweeping a floor no one else would sweep. And from that impossible faithfulness came the restoration of something ancient, the reform of something corrupt, and a love that was built on the most solid foundation there is, the knowledge that you chose each other before you knew what you were getting, that you kept faith before you had any evidence it would be answered, and that you chose, again and again, to stay. If this story has found you today, if it has reached something in you that needed reaching, please let us know in the comments below. Tell us what part stayed with you. Tell us if you are someone who tends fires no one else sees. Tell us if you have been the overlooked, the border village, the omega healer who keeps showing up because stopping would feel like a betrayal of something true. We see you. Kale and Lyra see you. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do so. Now, because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one, stories about the power of small faithfulnesses and the love that becomes possible when two people see each other clearly and choose to stay anyway. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that tending matters. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next story.